My name is Elemi Ademola Oluwaseun. I am one of the beneficiaries of TAP project, and I'll be talking about what I've learned so far in the ICB training. That's the intellectual capacity building. It has about 6 modules in the training for in the beginning, and the first module was just talking about the 6 critical processes of thinking. Another module was talking about emotional intelligence. It was talking about practical intelligence, um, intelligence by acquaintance, practical intelligence, and how you can conceptualize on their particular construct. Another module talked about inductive and deductive reasoning. We as humans physically we rely on inductive reasoning basically, and on our everyday life, on the way we see things and the way we do things, why we should rely basically on deductive reasoning because of the conceptual premises and because it is based on factual reasoning. Another module was talking about introduction to designing point of view and impact to African consciousness, where we look at different stories about Africa, 2 different stories, and how African leaders behave. I have done an audio included in this video. Good day. My name is Elem Dademola Oluwaseun. I'm a beneficiary of the TAP project, and I'll be talking about the lessons I learned from intellectual capacity building. And we talked about it. The course was divided into 6 modules. I'll start with the first one. That's introduction to concept of knowledge. The other module, let me just start with the first, introduction to concept of knowledge. When we are talking about knowledge, first of all, divine knowledge, and I will talk about the head body, which is epistemology. Let me start. Knowledge is a recognized or comprehension of objects, subjects such as fact, information, description of skills, and epistemology, which is like the head, the figurehead. It simply is the study of nature of knowledge in relation to rationalism and justification of belief. That's what epistemology is talking about. Knowledge can be divided into 3. We have the practical knowledge, the knowledge by acquaintance, the factual knowledge. Practical knowledge, when we talk about practical knowledge, this is knowledge in relation to functional or skill based, how to drive a car, knowing how to do arithmetic. Another one is by the acquaintance. We're talking about knowledge in account of familiarity with people, objects, for example, knowing your parents, knowing your car. And the third one, which is factual knowledge, was this is knowledge based on facts. For example, knowing that water is wet, knowing that the rock is hard. So when we are talking about factual knowledge, we also had to dive in a little bit to philosophy. Philosophy is a part of factual knowledge. So it's still under epistemology, and the epistemology has to approach the empirism and rationalism. And according to empirism, this is a knowledge that originates through our senses or through experience. That's just what empirism is talking about. For example, let me say I know there is usually traffic in Lagos during rush hour because I have experienced it. That is an example of empirism. When we are talking about rationalism, this is kind of different. This is knowledge that originates as a true reason. There must be a particular reason attached to it. That's when we can call it rationalism. So for example, let me use the first scenario. I know there's usually heavy traffic in Lagos during rush hour because of the huge population in Lagos, because of poor access road, because of the time is usually rush hour when people are closed from work and they're trying to get home. So this, you can see my reasons. Those are that's what I'm trying to explain rationalism. So we also talked about skepticism. Skepticism is just like a general approach or attitude on claims. That's just what we talked about in that first slide. In that first slide, we talked about types of skepticism. We have the absolute, the academic skepticism, the limited skepticism, and Fionia skepticism. Sorry if I did not pronounce it well. Absolute skepticism. This is talking about it's question whether as human we can truly trust everything in any domain. The academic skepticism was just talking about that we cannot trust everything we know in any it's just like it's points that we cannot truly trust anything. That's what academic skepticism was talking about. The limited skepticism is talking about we can trust our knowledge in a particular domain, while the Fionia skepticism, this is a kind of, I like this, is a kind of bias. Let me say this is a neutral approach to knowledge. That's what Justice was talking about. And the second, we moved on to intelligence. That's an introduction to concept of intelligence. And this, we had to define what intelligence is. We defined the approaches, we defined types, and we talked about what intelligence is. Intelligence basically is the ability to learn or understand and make judgments or have opinions that are based on reason. That's what intelligence is all about. And we talked about theories of intelligence. There were different theories we talked about. Let me just go to one. We talked about Charles Spearman. Charles Spearman talked about one that this was based on general intelligence. Another thing we talked about was the fluid intelligence. The fluid intelligence is the ability to solve new problems, use logic in different situations. We talked about this crystallized intelligence, its ability to accumulate knowledge, facts, and skills. Another thing we talked about was primary mental ability. The primary mental ability, we have the verbal comprehension, the spatial comprehension, inductive reasoning, numbers, word fluency, associative memory, and perceptual speed. These are things we talked about in the slide. We talked about how intelligence can be divided. Intelligence can be divided according to that slide, according to the module rather, into 9. We have the verbal, the linguistic intelligence, the logical intelligence, musical intelligence, virtual spatial intelligence, bodily kinesical intelligence, interpersonal intelligence, neutralist intelligence, and existentially intelligent. That's what we talked about basically. Then we move on to emotion, the emotion type of intelligence, and that month we talked about intelligence. Emotion just has to do with feelings, how you see things, how you attribute to the environment, how you relate with what is going on around you. That's just what we talked about. The emotional intelligence was just like types of emotion, where emotion was internal. It's something that happens within us. That's what it's just talking about. And the emotion was divided into 4. We have the feelings, bodily arousal, social expressiveness, and sense of purpose. Another thing we just looked at is emotional intelligence can be conceptualized as either ability model, trait model, and mixed model. There was 3 different models we use, and under one of the model, we talked about emotional perception, emotional integration, emotional understanding, emotional management. We talked about a lot of things in that module. Under the trait model, we talked about intrapersonal stress management, adaptability, and general mood. And we We talked about empathy, we talked about interpersonal relationship, we talked about stress management, we talked about stress tolerance, impulse control, adaptability, we talked about reality testing, flexibility, problem solving, general mood, optimism. What else did we talk? Happiness. And we talked about self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, social skills. Empathy, we are talking about empathy. Empathy is can just be like having feelings for others. Will I say having feelings? Empathy is just like having self-awareness. Will I call it self-awareness? Like having a kind of ability to be aware or understand people's emotion. Let me use that language. That is what empathy is all about. And the next slide, we move into the third module. We move into introduction to inductive reasoning. Under inductive reasoning, we talk about a lot of things in that week. Another thing we talked about was the inductive and deductive reasoning. Inductive and deductive reasoning. Under the inductive reasoning, we just looked at inference and arguments, deductive reasoning itself, and different form of inductive reasoning. We looked at the logic of reasoning, which are inference and argument. Inference, this refers to drawing conclusion from premises. Premises can either be a statement of fact. Inference, for example, let me use an inference. You can see an adult crying and you infer that person is being hurt or sad. Another example, when we are talking about arguments are a collection of inferences, the combination of all inferences, and the statements can be declarative sentencing, imperative sentencing, interrogative sentencing, and exclamatory sentences. Another thing we just talked about was looking at different forms of sentences, the inference and the argument sentences, and we looked at inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is just talking about the truth of the premises provided based on that sentence. That's what we were looking at in inductive reasoning, and we were given different forms, different examples in the inductive reasoning. Let me now go to let me just state the types. We have the general inductive reasoning that draws conclusion from generalization. We have the statistical inductive reasoning that draws based on statistics. We have the sample based inductive reasoning that draws based on different sample group. Analog inductive reasoning, this one draws based on shared properties of two or more groups. We have the predictive inductive reasoning. It's based on prediction using a past sample. And we talked about causal inference inductive reasoning. This does confusion based on causal connection, different form of inductive reasoning. Now let me go to the deductive reasoning. In the deductive reasoning, it also has its own logic and an argument. Let me say that in statements, and it's still the same premises. Statement, it still has same premises, the same way in inductive as. And under this, statement can be declarative, imperative, interrogative, and also it's still exclamative under deductive. The deductive, it starts from the theory to the observation. It's just like from the theory to the observation, very different from the inductive reasoning. Another thing we looked at was evidence that supports both inductive and deductive reasoning is direct or experimental evidence, statistical evidence, anecdotal evidence, argumentative evidence, testimonial evidence, and logical evidence. Those are different forms of evidence that support inductive and deductive reasoning. Then we move on to introduction to the next module we looked at was introduction to dual thought processes, and under this we talked about a lot. Under this we had to learn about type 1 and type 2 cognitive processes, pros and cons of type 1 and type 2 cognitive processes, the benefit and pitfall of intuition. Those are the three things we just looked at in this in the course of this module. And we looked at what is information processes. When we are looking at it, it's just like the study of information by how it is being processed in the brain. These are what we looked at it during the course of this study. Then we looked at another slide, introduction to bounded rationality in behavior economics. And this, we looked at a lot of things in this slide. The purpose we wanted, it was the social, physiological, emotional influence on economic decision, how decision had been made. This is what the slide was just talking about, how profit and money is related to money. Like the classical theory of economics, utility that predict that human being will make decisions to maximize their own economic growth, economic gain. It's agreed that individual pursue selfish motive and a self-interest. Everybody thinks about themselves. That was what this was trying to talk about in the slide. And he said the human behavior is not motivated by gain alone, it is motivated by moral values, rules and virtue. For example, it was talking about sense of justice, sense of fairness, sense of reciprocity, heuristic and biases, relevant information. So it's just talking about a lot of things that we looked at: emotional, social, cognitive and physical factor after economic decision, how decision are being made. We talked about the type 1 and type 2 cognitive process inside these processes, and we talked about bounded rationality challenges, that it's notional that people are self-interested and seek optimal utility outcome. We talked about time. In the example, we talked about a lot of things. We talked about limit of human brain a lot in this slide. It was a lot of things we talked about. We also talked about framing effect. This is a physiological bias that influences individuals to pick positively frame option over negatively frame option. That was what we talked about in this topic. We talked about how economics, however, is not always so simple or straightforward, but it can be naive to assume sometimes. We talked about a lot in this slide. Oh God. Then the next module we did introduction to designing point of view and impact on African consciousness. So what we did, and that was the last module. It was just talking about how to understand two different points of view, which can be dramatic, different from each other, and yet they are correct. Another thing talked about was understanding the effect of misinterpretation of Africa or Africa consciousness. In this area is talked about introduction to discerning of point of view and impact on African consciousness. We saw the two factual accounts of the same story, entirely different from each other. We also briefly touched on different subjects of representation of Africa, both present and past, and possible influences and implicit negative conception of ourselves, maybe through our ancestors. And we also talked about explicit cognitive processes. So these are one of the things we talked about in this topic.